Hello YouTube and welcome to my channel. My name is Robert and don't mind the hoodie, it's laundry day. And continuing with my Roman history month of March, we're having a look at the Roman Emperor's family tree. This came up on a YouTube search when I was looking for something for today. And I thought, well, there's a thought. How are all the emperors related? Are they related? I know the first two were, for sure, Caesar, Julius Caesar, and Augustus. And before we get into this, if you'd like to support my channel, please consider subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything, it's 100% free, and it really does helps my channel out. Hit the post notification bell. When I drop new content, you'll be notified. Give the video a thumbs up, and feel free to leave a comment. Okay, the Roman Emperor's Family Tree, Part 1. Here we go.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Roman emperors during the Principate. The Principate refers to the first 250 plus years of the Roman Empire, which was when the empire was united, for the most part. The period after the Principate is known as the Dominate, which is when the empire was then split into East and West. I'll be covering that part of the family tree in a separate video. So in this video, I'll be starting with the dictator Julius Caesar and then going all the way down to Diocletian, who was the emperor that decided to split things in two. If you want to get a copy of this chart as a poster, it's available on our website, UsefulCharts.com. If you've been following us for a while, you'll notice that this is a new, much improved version of the chart. For example, in addition to the Roman emperors, it now also includes the Huns, Ostrogoths, Lombards, and Merovingian Franks, which I'll be covering in future videos as well. So last week on this channel, Jack Rackham talked about the legendary founding of Rome, as well as its first 7 kings. Well, after those 7 kings, Rome went on to become a republic, and it remained a republic for almost 500 years, which brings us to the start of this chart. In the final days of the Roman Republic, there were 2 powerful generals who dominated the scene, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Together with a 3rd general named Crassus, they had an unofficial power-sharing arrangement, often referred to as the First Triumvirate. However, Crassus ended up dying while trying to conquer Parthia, and this in
And a little note on that, when he was captured, they poured molten gold down his throat. That's probably where Game of Thrones got the idea, with the gold on the head.
Inadvertently led to a full-on civil war between Caesar and Pompey. In the end, Caesar ended up the winner, and Pompey ended up dead, which meant that Caesar was the sole remaining strongman. In 44 BCE, he was given the title Dictator for Life, which made a lot of people nervous because that sounded a lot like having a king. So as you probably know, a group of senators got together and conspired to assassinate Caesar, which they did by stabbing him to death during a Senate meeting. The 2 leaders of the conspiracy were Brutus and Cassius. Brutus was the son of Caesar's longtime lover Servilia, and Cassius was her son-in-law. Officially, Caesar had only one biological child, Julia. Before the Civil War, she had been forced to marry the much older Pompey in order to cement the political alliance. However, Julia died in childbirth, and therefore Caesar ended up adopting his sister's grandson, the future Augustus, as his son and heir. At the time, Augustus was known as Octavian. Thus, after Caesar's assassination, a 2nd triumvirate was formed, this time an official one, with Octavian being made one of the 3 rulers. The other 2 were Mark Antony and Lepidus, both of whom had been close allies of Caesar, Lepidus being yet another son-in-law of Caesar's lover Servilia. However, like the first triumvirate, the second triumvirate didn't last long. Lepidus was eventually kicked out, and then Mark Antony and Octavian went head-to-head. One of the reasons for this was that even though Mark Antony had married Octavian's sister Octavia, he was also having a relationship with Cleopatra, the pharaoh of Egypt, and former lover of Julius Caesar. In fact, Mark Antony and Cleopatra had several children together, and there was a fear that those children would one day become powerful monarchs. There was also the fact that, unofficially, Julius Caesar did actually have another biological child, a son, with Cleopatra named Caesarion. So Octavian declared war on Cleopatra, meaning that he was also at war with Mark Antony.
Yeah.
Octavian then went on to win the famous Battle of Actium, after which Cleopatra and Mark Antony committed suicide. Caesarion was murdered, and Egypt was annexed by Rome. 3 years later, in 27 BCE, Octavian was given the title of Augustus, meaning venerable. Thus, 27 BCE is the date that most historians use for the start of the Roman Empire, although technically Rome still continued to be a republic. Augustus was given the title Princeps Civitatis, meaning first citizen, which indicated that he was merely the first among equals, which is why this period is called the Principate. However, in all practical terms, Augustus and his successors were monarchs. Interestingly, the term emperor didn't even really exist initially, at least not in the way we use it today. Back then, the Latin word imperator simply meant something like commander, and it was a title given to any military leader after a great victory. However, over time, it was used exclusively for the successors of Augustus. Because Roman emperors used so many different titles, we've included a quick guide to the key terms along the side of the chart. Okay, let's continue down the family tree. Augustus did not have any sons. However, he did have a daughter, Julia, who married Marcus Agrippa, who was the general who oversaw the Battle of Actium. Together, they had 3 sons, including Gaius and Lucius, who Augustus then adopted as his own. However, both Gaius and Lucius died before him, and therefore Augustus had to look elsewhere for a new heir. There was the 3rd grandson named Agrippa Posthumus, but he was deemed unsuitable and was eventually banished from the family. This left his stepson Tiberius. Augustus had favored his other stepson, Drusus, but Drusus had died before Gaius and Lucius. Therefore, Augustus adopted Tiberius as his heir, based on the agreement that Tiberius would adopt Drusus's son, Germanicus, as his heir. Germanicus also happened to be the grandson of Mark Antony and the emperor's sister, so that made for a nice, neat line of succession. So when Augustus died, Tiberius became the next emperor.
Yes.
And as for that 3rd son, Agrippa Posthumus, well, he was killed by his own guard as soon as Augustus's death had been announced. But things did not go quite as planned.
Nope.
Germanicus, who was more popular than Tiberius, and who probably would have made a great emperor, died under mysterious circumstances. And therefore, when Tiberius died, he ended up being succeeded by Germanicus's sole surviving son, Caligula, who was only 25 at the time. I should also note that it was during the reign of Tiberius that a certain man named Jesus of Nazareth was crucified over in the Roman province of Judea. Caligula's mother was Agrippina the Elder, and thus he was the biological great-grandson of Emperor Augustus. However, Caligula ended up being a crazed tyrant and was assassinated after just 4 years by his own guard. At this point, the only remaining male in the family was Germanicus's brother, Claudius, and thus he was declared to be the next emperor. It was during the reign of Claudius that the Roman conquest of Britannia began. Claudius was married 4 times, lastly to Caligula's sister, Agrippina the Younger. She had a son named Nero, who Claudius then named as his heir. At age 17, Nero thus became the 5th and final emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. These 5 emperors all connect back to Julius Caesar through adoption, and 4 of them have blood connections to Claudius, hence the name Julio-Claudian. Nero is mostly remembered because of the legend that he played a harp or fiddle while watching Rome burn during the Great Fire of 64 CE, which he may or may not have helped to start. He is also said to have blamed the fire on the new Jewish sect known as Christianity, which led to the first major persecution of Christians within the Roman Empire, which in turn led to the execution of both Peter and Paul. In fact, the famous number 666 from the book of Revelation is most likely a reference to Nero, who the early Christians saw as an antichrist. Now, while it's unlikely that Nero actually played a fiddle while Rome burned, he did become more and more insane, and eventually at age 30, he was forced to commit suicide with the help of his secretary. At this point, a man named Galba, who was serving as the governor of Hispania, was declared emperor. But in January of the following year, he was assassinated, resulting in the Year of the 4 Emperors. After Galba came Otho, the first husband of Nero's second wife, Sabina. But then Otho was defeated by a general named Vitellius, resulting in Otho committing suicide and Vitellius being declared emperor. However, a few months later, Otho's former supporters aligned with a different general named Vespasian, and Vespasian was declared emperor as well. When it became clear that Vespasian's armies would take Rome, Vitellius tried to abdicate but was executed instead. The Year of the 4 Emperors thus ended with Vespasian on the throne, and the new Flavian dynasty replacing the former Julio-Claudian dynasty. Vespasian had been laying siege to Jerusalem when he was declared emperor. So the task of taking the city was left in the hands of his son Titus, who ended up capturing Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, destroying the Second Temple in the process. On this channel, I often refer to this event as being a key turning point in religious history because it led to the development of both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. To this day, the Arch of Titus stands in Rome, commemorating Titus's victory over the Jews. This particular panel is well known in that it shows the Romans carting off the menorah that had once stood in the Second Temple. However, it was another 9 years before Titus actually succeeded his father as emperor. During that time, Vespasian ordered the construction of Rome's most famous landmark, the Colosseum, which was finally completed during the first year of Titus's reign. Another event that occurred during Titus's first year was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which led to the nearby town of Pompeii being completely buried by ash. Now, while that was certainly a horrible fate for the people of Pompeii, it ended up being very useful for future archaeologists. In that it almost perfectly preserved things, allowing us to gain information about what Roman life was like at the time. After just 2 years as emperor, Titus suddenly died from a fever, although some suspect that his brother Domitian might have poisoned him, and Jewish tradition claims that God punished him for destroying the Jewish temple by letting a fly go up his nose, giving him a brain infection. Whatever the cause was, he was succeeded by his younger brother Domitian, who went on to rule for 15 years, during which time he may have renewed the persecution against Christians, although this is debated. What is not debated is that the book of Revelation was almost certainly written during Domitian's reign. Overall, Domitian was nowhere near as popular in Rome as his brother Titus was, and therefore he was eventually assassinated by court officials, who then proceeded to make his elderly advisor Nerva the emperor instead. The Flavian dynasty thus ended up being quite short-lived. However, it did have a lasting impact on the empire in that it helped to stabilize things and to increase the power of the emperor, mostly at the expense of the Senate. It was also the Flavians who funded the Jewish historian Josephus, from whose work most of our knowledge of first century Judea comes from. Starting with Nerva, we then get the 5 good emperors, during whose consecutive reigns the Roman Empire reached its peak in terms of prosperity, stability, and territorial expansion. Nerva only reigned a few short years before dying of natural causes, but before his death, he agreed to adopt and name the popular general Trajan as his heir, which ended up leading to a new tradition whereby emperors chose their successors based primarily on merit instead of family ties. Interestingly, though, Trajan did have a family connection to a previous emperor. His mother Marcia was the sister of Emperor Titus's second wife. Trajan is generally considered to be one of the greatest Roman emperors. He expanded the empire's borders to their greatest extent, conquering Dacia, for example, which basically corresponds to modern Romania. It was his victories in Dacia that became memorialized on the famous landmark in Rome known as Trajan's Column. It was also during the reign of Trajan that the famous Roman historian Tacitus was producing his works. It is in large part because of Tacitus that we know everything that has been discussed in this video so far. Trajan selected as his heir Hadrian, who was his first cousin once removed. You can see here that both men were the descendants of a man named Ulpius. However, they were also related in that Hadrian was married to the granddaughter of Trajan's sister. Hadrian is the namesake of Hadrian's Wall, which is the 73-mile-long wall he had built in northern England, and which still exists to this day. He was also the emperor during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, which the Romans managed to suppress, but only after heavy casualties. Following the revolt, Judea was renamed as Palestine. A new city named Aelia Capitolina was constructed over the ruins of Jerusalem, and a temple to Zeus was built where the Jewish temple had once stood.
Oh, wow.
Hadrian chose as his successor Lucius Aelius, but Lucius Aelius died shortly before Hadrian, and therefore Hadrian was forced to come up with a plan B. That involved Antoninus Pius being named as the new heir, with the caveat that Antoninus would adopt Lucius Aelius's son, Lucius Verus, as well as Hadrian's grandnephew, Marcus Aurelius. As far as we know, not much happened during the reign of Antoninus Pius. In other words, things were pretty peaceful. So peaceful that the Romans were able to focus on other things, like sending an envoy all the way to China for the first time.
Oh, wow.
However, during the reign of the next emperor, Marcus Aurelius, things heated up again. There were wars in the east with Parthia, as well as in the north with the Germanic tribes. Actually, I should say next emperors, because although Marcus Aurelius ended up being the primary emperor, he did follow Hadrian's wishes by allowing Lucius Verus to serve as co-emperor alongside him. Note that Marcus Aurelius married the daughter of Antoninus Pius, which is likely one of the reasons he ended up being favored. However, he then arranged a marriage between his daughter Lucilla and Lucius Verus in order to strengthen their alliance. So this was actually the first time that the Roman Empire was ruled by 2 emperors at once, although Lucius Verus ended up dying first, probably from the Antonine Plague, which was the first pandemic to hit the Roman Empire. But even though Marcus Aurelius had a lot to deal with during his reign, he is actually mostly remembered for being a philosopher, a Stoic philosopher to be precise. In fact, his book Meditations is one of the classic texts of Stoic philosophy. So he stands out as being one of the few leaders in the history of the Western world that actually fit the idea of the philosopher king, that Plato had proposed many centuries earlier.
Okay.
However, although Marcus Aurelius was wise, he made one very bad decision, and that decision started Rome down a path of decline. Rather than adopt an heir based on merit, he allowed his 19-year-old son Commodus to succeed him.
My goodness.
And like the other young emperors before him, Caligula and Nero, Commodus was a megalomaniac. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, you'll have a rough idea of what he was like. Well, surprise, surprise, Commodus ended up being assassinated. Not by a Russell Crowe-like gladiator, but by his wrestling buddy in the bathtub. He died on New Year's Eve, and thus the next year, 193 CE, ended up being the very chaotic Year of the 5 Emperors. So, one more than the previous Year of the 4 Emperors.
Wow.
He was first replaced with Pertinax, but Pertinax was assassinated after only 3 months by the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard were basically the emperor's own bodyguards, kind of like the Secret Service in the US. Previously, they had been the ones responsible for assassinating both Caligula and Galba, and they would go on to assassinate many more emperors as well. After killing Pertinax, they basically offered the emperorship to the highest bidder. That ended up being Didius Julianus. However, shortly thereafter, Septimius Severus and Pescennius Niger were both declared emperor as well by their troops. Severus reached Rome first and had Didius Julianus executed. He then engaged in a civil war against Niger. Another possible threat was a man named Clodius Albinus. So initially, Severus agreed to let Albinus serve as a sort of junior emperor. However, after Severus defeated Niger, Albinus turned on him as well. So Severus ended up having to fight Albinus also. But Severus emerged as the clear winner, and thus a new dynasty was created, the Severan dynasty. During Severus's reign, both of his sons, Geta and Caracalla, ended up being named as junior emperors, and therefore when Severus died, Rome once again ended up with a pair of co-emperors. However, the older brother, Caracalla, wasn't happy with this, and very quickly had his brother Geta assassinated, becoming the sole emperor.
Wow.
From a genealogical point of view, the most interesting thing about Caracalla was his maternal line. His mother, Julia Domna, was the daughter of Julius Bassianus, who was the high priest of the god Elagabalus in Emesa, Syria. In turn, he was the descendant of the earlier priest kings of Emesa, who included Alexion and Sohamus. Alexion's mother was Drusilla, the daughter of Ptolemy, king of Mauritania, and Ptolemy was in turn the child of Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. But Caracalla was yet another victim of the Praetorian Guard. This time, the leader of the Praetorian Guard himself, a man named Macrinus, became the next emperor.
Wow.
He was also the first emperor from the equestrian class, which was the second highest class in Roman society, after the senatorial class. Previously, every Roman emperor had been from the top class. This was a taste of things to come, because from this point forward, power would continue to shift away from the Senate and toward the military. However, Macrinus himself did not remain in charge for long.
Apparently.
Instead, Caracalla's powerful aunt, Julia Mesa, managed to get her grandson, Elagabalus, named after the Syrian god, to be declared emperor instead, thus restoring the Severan dynasty.
Wow.
Elagabalus was the youngest emperor to date, at just 14 years old, and yet again, having a teenage emperor proved to be disastrous. Even though his mother and grandmother were there to guide him, Elagabalus initiated all sorts of controversial religious changes and engaged in sexual behaviors that even the Romans considered to be over the top. So I bet you can guess what happened.
Yeah.
Yep, he was assassinated and replaced by his cousin Severus Alexander, who was also just 14 years old when he started his reign. But Severus Alexander ended up being a much more stable ruler and managed to remain in power for a whole 13 years before he too was, assassinated. This time, a military commander named Maximus Thrax was declared emperor, marking the beginning of a 50-year period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, in which there was a new emperor pretty much every other year, most of them being military men rather than statesmen. We already had the year of the 4 emperors and the year of the 5 emperors. Well, near the beginning of the Crisis of the 3rd Century, there was also the year of the 6 emperors. That was in the year 238. It began with the elderly Gordian I being declared emperor, along with his son Gordian II, in the province of Africa. But they were soon defeated by a nearby army, earning them the title of the shortest reigning emperors ever, at 22 days each. At this point,
22 days each.
Senators were appointed co-emperors instead, and Maximus Thrax was assassinated by his own troops. But the 2 senators were unpopular with the everyday people, so they were forced to name Gordian I's grandson, Gordian III, as junior emperor. Shortly thereafter, though, both the senators were assassinated. By the Praetorian Guard, leaving Gordian III as the...
I'm surprised they didn't disband the Praetorian Guard. They keep killing them off. What the hell?
the sole remaining emperor at the end of the year 238. Gordian III was just 13 years old at the start of his reign, and he managed to last for 6 years. By this point, the Parthian Empire in Persia had been replaced by the Sassanid Empire, and therefore under Gordian III, Rome decided to meet the Sassanids head-on. However, the campaign mostly failed, and Gordian III died in the process. Next came Philip the Arab, who may have actually been the first Christian emperor, long before Constantine, although there is some debate over this. It doesn't really matter, though, because he and his son were killed after just 5 years and replaced with Decius. Decius was the opposite, in that he actually went out of his way to persecute Christians. In fact, he issued an edict requiring everyone in the empire to worship the Roman gods. The Jews received an exemption, as Judaism had been made a legal religion all the way back in the days of Julius Caesar. But the Christians did not receive an exemption, and therefore many of them were put to death. Decius himself died after just 2 years as emperor during one of the first ever Gothic wars. The Goths were one of the major Germanic tribes, and they would continue to plague the Romans for the next 300 years, ultimately leading to the fall of Rome itself. But we're not quite there yet. Next up was Gallus, and then Aemilianus, and then Valerian. Valerian had the longest reign out of the so-called Baric emperors, but then wound up being the first Roman emperor to be captured as a prisoner of war by an enemy, in this case by the Sassanid emperor Shapur I. He had named his son Gallienus his co-emperor, so after his capture, Gallienus continued to reign on his own for another 6 years. However, it was during his reign that the Roman Empire almost collapsed. First, a leading general in the West, known as Postumus, decided to set up his own breakaway empire, known as the Gallic Empire, instead of trying to compete for the whole thing. At the same time, in the east, a Syrian noble named Odaenathus was declared king, and he managed to push back the Sassanids, which earned him the title King of Kings of the East. So it seemed as though the empire was starting to break into 3 parts. This worsened when the leaders of all 3 parts were assassinated within the space of just 2 years. In the east, Odaenathus was succeeded by his son, but it was his wife, Queen Zenobia, that held the real power. She managed to conquer Egypt and was eventually declared empress, formally cutting ties with Rome and forming the breakaway Palmyrene Empire. Meanwhile, in the Gallic Empire, Postumus was followed in rapid succession by 3 more emperors, while in the main part of the Roman Empire, Gallienus was followed first by Claudius II, then by Claudius's brother Quintillus, and then by Aurelian. However, Aurelian managed to pull everything together again, reconquering both the Gallic Empire and the Palmyrene Empire. And for this reason, he is generally considered to have been the most important emperor during the crisis of the 3rd century.
Really?
Things slowly started to improve after Aurelian, but still no emperor seemed to be able to hold on to power for long.
Wow.
That is, until the defeat of Carinus by Diocletian. With the rise of Diocletian, the crisis of the 3rd century came to an end, as well as the period of the Principate. The next chapter in Rome's history would become known as the Dominate, based on the Latin word dominus, which means Lord. By this point, Rome was no longer pretending that it was still a republic, and hence Diocletian added the word dominus to his list of titles. He also made the decision to split the empire into 2 parts, west and east. But that's a story for another day. Next month, I'll be posting a part 2, in which I'll continue the family tree from Diocletian onwards. For now, let me remind you that if you want to purchase a copy of the chart as a poster, you can do so by visiting our website, UsefulCharts.com. Thanks for watching.
Well, there we have it. Roman Emperor's family tree. Okay, I have to admit, that was a lot better than I thought it would be. 6 emperors in a year? Or no, it was definitely 4 were in a year. It's like, how do you... Wow. The emperor's bodyguards assassinating them. Oh yeah, you're not doing a good enough job, we'll just end you. Wow. I know it was thousands of years ago, but imagine being 13 and placed to that much authority. You're going to go a little nuts, you know. You're just going to be the ultimate brat. Sexual acts even the Romans found outrageous. Well, I hope you enjoyed that just as much as I did. And we'll see you again next time. Have a great day. Goodbye.